Well, there are two very predictable things about politics right now. Here's one of them. The Democrat Senate candidate for the American state of Nevada was always going to scrape over the line after the lights in some of that electorate's vote counting stations mysteriously malfunctioned in the middle of the night last Thursday. And here's the other one. The Labor Party of Australia was always going to introduce legislation bringing back the bad old days of excessive union power after not mentioning it as a policy during the federal election campaign in May. How is that legislation going now? Well, let's get in Stephen Cenatiempo, the host of the Breakfast Talkback show on Canberra's 2CC and one of the most common sense commentators in the country, to find out. Stephen, welcome back to the show.
G'day, Fred. Good to be back with you.
Stephen, the government's legislation, among other things, this is the new industrial relations legislation, among other things, enables unions and the Fair Work Commission to force companies to be part of industry-wide wage deals, whether they want to or not. Now, the business community has reacted not very happily to this, but how is the legislation itself tracking through Parliament now?
Well, it's gone through the lower house, as you would expect, but I guess there's a certain irony that it's being held up in the Senate by David Pocock and Jackie Lambie, who have shown a little bit of common sense on this. But I think Paul Kelly nailed it in The Australian last week, and he said this legislation fails the two fundamental tests that any legislation has to go through. Firstly, they've got no mandate for it, although they're claiming that they said, oh, well, we said before the election we'd try and increase wages. This won't do that, but they're trying to use that as cover. And the second thing is it's bad policy. There's about 300 pages of amendments they've already had to introduce only a week after they put this bill forward. I mean, it's just extraordinary that you don't do your homework beforehand. And what it proves is that it's all well and good to snipe from the sidelines when you're in opposition. But when you go to an election with no plan and very, very little legislative agenda, you then find it very difficult to govern if you finally win the election. Now, they told us that everything was terrible and Scott Morrison was the worst Prime Minister ever. And don't get me wrong, he was no champion by any stretch of the imagination. But once you get there, you've then got to hit the ground running and govern. Now, they've been allowed to get away with that because the unions and the public service and the media have basically given them cover. But they've hit their first hurdle domestically. And I think the best thing that can happen for Albo is that he gets another overseas trip, because he seems to perform well when he's not out of the country.
Yeah,
but
he's spending a lot of... Yeah, that's true. Well, just getting back to that legislation before we move on to the style of government that we find ourselves under, do you think they actually read this stuff? I mean, if they had to add 300 pages to the legislation, who's actually reading it? Anyone?
Well, look, no, I think they are reading it, but I think the reality is this legislation was largely written by the unions, and the government's realised, well, hang on a sec, we can't go holeless bowless back to the bad old days of the 1970s. And I've actually put this to a couple of Labor politicians, and I said, well, hang on, this is like 1970-style collective bargaining, and their argument is, but it's not 1970 anymore. And my point is, exactly, it's not 1970 anymore. This is the point you guys are missing. There is not a single business group in the country that supports this legislation. And again, I put this to a couple of Labor politicians who say, oh, no, well, we don't know that that's necessarily true. And I rattled off every business group I could think of that has opposed the legislation and said, who's left? And you get the, well, somebody.
Yeah, there's someone.
Yeah,
there's got to be someone.